All right, we're going to move on to our second reading packet about Franz Joseph Haydn. And it's the one that has a picture of him in the upper left corner. It says that he was born on March 31st, 1732, and he died on May 31st of 1809. And here's a few things about him. He was a composer of the classical era, which is the one you know that we're in. He was the second of 12 children, and his family was quite poor. When he was 6, his parents sent him to live with a family relative, Johann Frank, in Hainburg, Austria. We learned about that earlier. And Mr. Frank was a private music teacher, gave him lessons on the harpsichord, violin, and in music harmony and theory. And in Hainburg, young Franz sang in the church boy choir and eventually became the chief soloist for the group. Now, in this version of his biography, it says that when he turned 17, he became too old for the boy choir. We know he also got in trouble. He made a living playing harpsichord and violin. He began composing and completed his first mass at age 19, his first string quartet at age 23, and his first symphony at 27. And then it goes on to say that he married his wife Anna in 1760, and they separated a few years later, but he continued to support Anna for the rest of her life. And we also remember all the stories about her and how she was not a good catch. She was not good. But he was an upstanding person and supported her. And, I mean, they stayed married even if they didn't live together in the same place or he needed to stay out of the house. Whatever. In 1761, he became the assistant choir master to Prince Paul Esterhazy, an Austrian prince who was a great admirer of music. And then he eventually became a full-time court musician and lived and worked in the Esterhazy Palace for 29 years until the death of the prince in 1790. His daily routine required him to provide music for family concerts, private performances, and worship services. The prince also had an excellent orchestra which regularly performed Haydn's composition. That's pretty great. I think back on Bach's life and how toward the end of his life, all he wanted to do was compose and do this awesome music, but all he had were like these amateurs and students, and so this remarkable music that he wrote ended up being played by people who really were not qualified to play it. This is not the case for Haydn. He had a great orchestra, and they played his stuff all the time, so that's a very satisfying situation for a musician to be in. Living in the palace, Haydn was cut off from the musical centers of Europe and, except for a few brief trips to Vienna, Austria, was not exposed to the music of other composers. He therefore developed his own style of music. He was not influenced by other composers with the exception of Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, who Haydn met in 1781. When they met, Haydn was 49 and Mozart was 25. Nevertheless, the older Haydn was influenced by the younger Mozart. And we're going to talk next about Mozart after we're done with Haydn, and you will understand why. He was a force to be reckoned with, for sure. In 1791, after the death of Prince Esterhazy, Haydn traveled to London, where he was highly regarded by British royalty. Here he heard the music of George Friedrich Handel, who you know all about now, and was much impressed with Handel's oratorios. In 1795, he returned permanently to Austria and settled in Vienna, where he wrote the Emperor's Hymn, which is now the national anthem of Austria. Inspired by Handel, Haydn also wrote several successful oratorios. By his mid-60s, Haydn's health was failing. For the last 10 years of his life, he wrote little, although he frequently attended concert performances of his music. Franz Joseph Haydn was a personable man, generous and honorable. He was much admired by royalty throughout Europe. He wrote a large number of works and was very industrious as a composer. He was fortunate to have a patron, Prince Esterhazy, who gave him the freedom to write music for a variety of occasions. However, it was not until Haydn was over 40 that his music was successful in concert halls outside the Esterhazy Palace. And so this is something I just want to talk about a minute. The fact that he had a patron. So this is something that changed over the course of the classical period. So we're talking about a composer toward the beginning of the classical period. And and he had a patron. And even though Prince Esterhazy gave Haydn, you know, really a lot of freedom to write the kind of music that he wanted to, Haydn was still a servant of the prince. He still was expected to wear a uniform. He was expected to do whatever the prince asked him to do. And even though the prince made it really pleasant for him, he was really still just a servant of the prince. And in this time period, though, as we will see with Mozart and then most definitely with Beethoven, that system changes. And now musicians are going to be writing music because they want to. And they're going to be putting music in concert halls on their own, not because they are a servant of a king or queen or noble person. So let's turn the page and talk a little bit about what are the different kinds of things that Haydn composed. He composed pieces for orchestra, he composed concertos, he composed chamber music, that's for smaller groups, he composed music for keyboards, he composed opera, he composed choral music, and he composed vocal solos. So just lots of music. Let's talk about some factoids as well. He composed over 175 pieces for the baritone. I gotta figure out how to say that. I think I'm saying it wrong. A string instrument played with a bow, which had as many as 40 strings. It's crazy. It was the only instrument his patron, Prince Esterhazy, could play, so it's no wonder he wrote so much music for it. Beethoven was a student of Haydn. And although he never had children of his own, Haydn was often called Papa Haydn because of his jolly personality. According to Haydn, he was not influenced by any composer except Mozart. He said, "There was no one near to confuse me, so it was forced to become more original." That's an interesting way to look at it. And then let's talk about some of the things historically that were happening. You have a timeline at the bottom of this page. In 1732, he was born, and also George Washington was born. So that gives you kind of a frame of reference of kind of where we are in history now. In 1742, Handel's Messiah was first performed in Dublin. We talked all about that. 1752, Benjamin Franklin proves that lightning is electricity. 1760, George III is crowned King of England. 1770, James Cook discovers the east coast of Australia. 1775, the American Revolution begins. Lots of stuff happening. 1783, Mozart composes his Mass in C minor. 1802, Beethoven composes Symphony No. 2 in D major. And then 1809, Haydn dies, and James Madison is inaugurated as the 4th president of the United States. So these things are all going on in Europe, where they have long had established culture. They, these countries have been countries for hundreds of years. And yet the United States is just this brand new baby little country without a whole lot of culture or customs of its own. So it's just a very interesting time in history. So next, in the next video, we are going to talk about a piece of music called the Surprise Symphony. This is one that if you've ever heard Haydn, this is probably the piece that you would have heard, and we'll talk more about it in the next video.